The Islamic Revolution at 35. Iranians mark the anniversary with what many consider a renewed embrace of the ideals of the founder of the Islamic Republic. But has the revolution delivered on its many promises? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Sami Zeidan. It's been 35 years since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, an event that changed the course of history for the country and the region. The revolution swept Shah Reza Pahlavi out of power and brought in Ayatollah Khomeini, a man who positioned himself against the corruption and decadence of his predecessor. Well, Khomeini marked a fresh start, but life was often difficult for Iranians in the years that followed, as millions of people commemorate the revolution right across Iran. Shahriar Shahabi gives us an inside look at their reflections.
The president's most important speech yet. At Iran's Azadi Tower, the country's symbol of freedom. And on the anniversary of a day that changed the course of Iranian history.
The former regime was trying to remove religion, while our people were seeking independence, freedom, and an Islamic republic.
Millions of Iranians watched Hassan Rouhani's speech from home and from the streets around the country. For them, Rouhani conveyed his government's message of national strength and peace.
Again, I promise the people, this government stands with the goals of the revolution, people's opinions and the orders of the supreme leader. And we will continue to adhere to the people's demands for the country's dignity. And this government will stand and resist with these goals until the end.
He made the comments in a time of tense foreign policy debate, which includes sensitive nuclear talks and the prospect of renewed ties with the United States. His government is facing intense pressure from Iranian hardliners and those elsewhere, including in the US and Israel. And to them, the president said this.
To those who hold the illusion that threats are on the table against the Iranian nation, I explicitly announce they need glasses. On no table in the world are there military threats against our nation.
There are many questions about the Iranian revolution, how important it still is, where it stands in Iran's history, and 35 years later, is it still relevant? Well, the simple answer to that, if you ask the people who came out to celebrate, is yes. And this is why.
Because of the blood of the martyrs, because of Imam Khomeini, because we should teach the U.S. a lesson. We are alive and back the establishment.
People participate in this ceremony for the goals of revolution because after years of U.S. global arrogance and domination, we became free and put the U.S. behind us. After 35 years, the U.S. has still not figured it out.
And many other Iranians too are figuring out how they can stay true to the revolution while moving the country forward. Shahriar Shahabi, Inside Story, Tehran.
Well, Iran has, over the years, defied many of the people who predicted the revolution's imminent collapse. But it has its fair share of challenges, you know. Top of the list, the economy. A combination of crippling sanctions and government mismanagement have contributed to high unemployment, inflation, and a devalued currency. Then there's the challenge to the political system, reflected by the protests in 2009. The government has to make the revolution relevant to a generation born after 1979. Well, related to that is political freedom. Restrictions on the opposition and the imprisonment of dissenting voices contributes to instability. And lastly, its relationship with the rest of the world. Progress has been made under President Rouhani, but Iran has a long way to go. It's not all been negative. Iranians have a lot to be proud of 35 years on. As we heard there, the revolution transformed the country from a monarchy to a republic with checks and balances on the different arms of power. Iran has become almost entirely self-sufficient for its defense, for example. It's made advances in all types of military hardware, from ballistic missiles to submarines. And it's strengthened its independence. Gone are the days when the CIA could orchestrate a coup against a democratically elected leader and install a pro-Western Shah. Well, for more on this now, I'm joined by our three guests from Tehran. Mohammad Marandi, Professor of Political Science at Tehran University. From Dubai, Shahriar Shahabi, Iranian businessman and tech entrepreneur. And in Tampa, Mohsen Milani, Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. Welcome to the show, everyone. Let's start with Mr. Mohsen Milani. How significant is this day for Iranians inside and outside the country, do you think?
I think it is an extremely significant day, not only for Iran and for the Iranians, but also for the greater Middle East and Central Asia, because 35 years ago, through a popular and peaceful revolution, one of the most popular in the history of modern revolutions, Iranians decided to get rid of the monarchical system, which was a despotic system, and then decided to establish an Islamic republic. The revolution in Iran changed the landscape of Iran, changed the landscape of the Persian Gulf and beyond, and I believe changed the landscape of the entire Middle East. One of the most important consequences of that revolution was that prior to the 1979 revolution, Islamic forces were marginalized. We often heard about the communists and the nationalists and secular forces. Because of the Islamic revolution, and particularly because of the leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini, Islam became relevant, and in the past 35 years, we have seen the gradual growth of Islamic movements, so much so that today Islam as a political force has become the dominant force in the entire Islamic world and the Middle East.
All right, let's bring in Shahriar Shahabi into the discussion now. If you look at some of the goals of the revolution, and maybe what we'll try and do in this show is to go through some of them point by point. Let's talk about freedoms. That was one of the big rallying motivations, wasn't it, for the revolution? Where does Iran today stand on freedoms and human rights? I guess on the one hand you can say, well, the Savak, the secret police, sort of the Shah's Gestapo, no longer exists, enforcing a secular dictatorship on the backs of people and burning people alive in ovens. But when you look at human rights reports, it's not all entirely positive either, is it now?
Well, I want to start this conversation by talking about President Clinton's '92 election. When he first ran for office, he started with one simple question, and that is, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? And the same question applies in Iran's case. Are we better off, are Iranians better off today than they were 35 years ago?
Precisely. What do you think then?
Well, the answer is no, they're not, because if you look at the track record, we measure a country, and anyone who studied business will know that the pastel model, the political, economic, social, telecommunications, technology, and languages. If you look at any of these measurements, you'll look that Iran has deteriorated. Now, having said that, on 4 of these conditions, Iranians have been able to sustain themselves, bring themselves up. But when it comes to the political aspect, the country has locked down, closed in on its people, and has not allowed the vibrancy of the Iranian people to flourish and demonstrate itself in a time where the internet has connected the world and made our world a lot smaller, opportunities much broader than our geographical boundaries, and yet we see 35 years later, Iranians having a very difficult time on the international scale, showing themselves, showing their talents, and showing what they can really contribute.
Mohammad Marandi, do you agree with that analysis there, that if you look at the overall scale, Iran has gone backwards, not forwards, when it comes to freedoms and human rights?
I don't agree. I think that it's quite obvious that when, for example, in the previous presidential elections, we had a 73% turnout, and the elections before that, when Mr. Ahmadinejad was elected, we had about an 80% turnout. Or just today across the country, there were huge rallies, and in Tehran, probably over a couple of million people participating. It's obvious that there's a great deal of public support for the Islamic Republic as a whole. It's not a utopia, nowhere else in the world is, but obviously 35 years ago, the country was basically run by the United States. The Shah had very frequent meetings with the US and British ambassadors. They played a very influential role in the country. Our country was not independent. The Shah and his family were taking a huge amount of the country's wealth. And the majority of Iranians were actually illiterate. most women in this country did not go to school. Most people did not have, and most major cities in the country outside of Tehran, Shiraz, Isfahan, and a couple of other major cities did not even have universities.
Okay,
right now,
I can see, sorry, Mr. Marandi, I can see Mr. Shahabi is shaking his head in complete disagreement. Why are you shaking your head, Mr. Shahabi?
The bottom line is we go back to the same rhetoric and we go back to the same conversation, that before the revolution, Iran was this oblivion, illiterate, underdeveloped country, and then after the revolution, all of a sudden, it's emerged as this superpower, where the facts are completely the opposite of what Dr. Marandi is saying. I mean, unemployment today, and when I talk about unemployment, I'm talking about unemployment and underemployment.
Okay,
if we staggering.
Mr. Shahabi, could we stay focused a minute on freedoms and human rights, and we'll get to the economic situation. You were about to say something. Let's talk about bloggers, the internet, opposition, political opposition, student rights and things like that.
But you got to understand why they're asking for their freedoms. You cannot operate a country and meet the demands of a young generation. And keep in mind that 75% of Iran's population is under the age of 35. That, like you said in the outset of the show, that they're born after the revolution. Now, what do these people want? With the internet, having access to satellite telecommunications, seeing the rest of the world, watching the rest of the world go by, their demand is not so much to say, look, give me individual freedoms. They're saying, give me individual freedoms so I can stand toe-to-toe and compete on a global level. You don't want freedoms in a vacuum. You want to use freedoms to do something great, to do something productive. And that's what the essence of civil liberties and freedoms are.
Sure, Mr. Marandi, go ahead.
Well, I disagree. Individual freedoms are indeed important, and the Shah refrained from allowing Iranians to have any freedom at any level. The country was basically run by the United States, and the Iranian people were humiliated. And no nation can build itself when it feels downtrodden and it feels oppressed, not only by a local dictator, but by a global hegemon. But beyond that,
Mr. Marandi, I mean, things today, coming back to today,
of reality.
How can we say today things are better if there are restrictions on the internet, if bloggers and activists are being jailed, if opposition figures are under house arrest? I guess that's the crux of the question.
No, look, let's be fair. We have different political parties in Iran. And if you're talking about Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi, who were arrested, well, they're not arrested, they're not in jail, but they're under house arrest. It was basically because they were behind the riots 4.5 years ago. And they were deeply involved in the mess that they created in the city of Tehran. I remember at that time the BBC was egging on protesters in Tehran when Mousavi claimed fraud, but just a few months later, when London people were rioting, there was even talk in England about blocking Facebook. So, and 6 or 7 people were killed in England. So I think the hypocrisy that we see in the West and the Western media is there for people to see.
Let's bring in Mohsen Milani. You are edging to get in there.
I do not know if our two guests remember the time of pre-revolution. Well, I was a student. I remember the pre-1970 Iran very well. And when it comes to freedom, I have to tell you, one of the major slogans of the Iranian Revolution was to have more freedom because they thought that they did not have enough freedom under the old regime.
So do you feel today that they got it, since you've lived both before and the after period?
Well, that is the point I was about to make, that if you look at personal freedoms, Iranians had much more personal freedom under the Shah than they do today. But if you look at political freedom, I think there is no question that the size of the elites, those who are participating in the political process, have expanded significantly, and you cannot compare pre-revolutionary time with the revolutionary time. But having said all of this, the human rights record of the Islamic Republic today is not a good record.
Okay.
The two leaders of the green movements are under house arrest, and there is simply no justification for putting under house arrest two of the leading characters of the Islamic Revolution. Mr. Mousavi was the prime minister of Ayatollah Khomeini for 7.5 years.
All right, let's move the discussion on. Point taken. I want to talk a little bit about the state of economic development, social justice. Those were part of the slogans which were being raised in 1979 and the months before the revolution, weren't they? Mr. Shahriar Shahabi, today Iran has a much larger middle class, doesn't it? It has a much larger educated class, the higher rates of educated women, which Professor Marandi was pointing out. Aren't those pluses for the revolution?
Well, what Mr. Marandi has omitted from his talk is that the educational institutions that were now capitalized on after the revolution were actually put in place by the previous regime. So let's be very clear on who did what. Now, as a result of that, the manifestation of that is that we've got a middle class that's now educated, is technologically savvy, understands globalization very well, and wants to get connected. But there is one thing that's standing in its way, and that is the political institution that denies them this right. Now, let me be very clear. When we talk about the unemployment rate today, the unofficial unemployment rate today is about 34%. The official rate is about 17 to 18%. But that does not even calculate the underemployed. Now, what do I mean by that? We have university students, graduates in engineering, in the life sciences, who are driving taxi cabs as a result of lack of economic opportunity. Now, statistics will not consider them as unemployed, but these are people that are not being utilized for their full potential.
Okay,
now,
all right, point taken. Let me move on a little bit because time is running here. I want to have a chance to bring in Mr. Marandi into the discussion. What's the point, I guess, is the question of talking about how we've got a bigger middle class in Iran, more educated people, if unemployment is running at over 10% or all the way to, well, you heard the figures there, depending on whose figures you believe. Inflation, even according to the Statistical Center of Iran, is at 35%. You've got a lot of educated, tech-savvy people with no job and no purchasing power, right?
Well, your guest could be talking about a number of countries in the EU, right? I mean, the rates that or the percentages that he was talking about remind me very much about countries like Spain. It's even worse in Greece. So, and these countries are not facing the most severe and really barbaric sanctions that any country has ever faced in the world, in the modern world during peace. The United States has targeted the Iranian economy. The United States has targeted the Iranian central bank. The United States is attempting to make ordinary people in Iran suffer. Over the last couple of years, because of the shutdown of the Iranian central bank, many people in Iran who were ill could not find medicine because the Americans were preventing the country from, and its allies were preventing the country from importing and exporting medicine. So while these European countries are facing social and economic crisis, the difficulties that the Iranians are facing today are to a large degree based upon external forces. In fact, there was a poll carried out by an American institution. It may have been Gallup, but I'm not sure at this moment, that said that roughly 70% of Iranians that were polled blamed Western countries for the current economic difficulties. And of course there's mismanagement in the country like there is elsewhere, but there's no denying that the barbaric and inhuman sanctions that have been imposed upon the Iranian people are extraordinary. But one final point is that the infrastructure for Iranian universities is something that was created after the revolution by
all right, I do want to get some time in to talk about the obvious one, relations with the outside world. And of course, when it comes to foreign relations, let's start with relations between the US and Iran. They weren't always as bad as they have been over the last 35 years. In fact, immediately after the revolution, the US courted the new Islamic government. But that ended after the hostage crisis in November 1979. It went on for 444 days and effectively severed ties between the two countries. Then in 1988, an American Navy ship in the Gulf shot down a commercial flight, killing all 290 Iranians on board. Not surprisingly, relations hit an all-time low. There was some hope of a thaw when reformist Mohammad Khatami was elected in 1997, but there was no breakthrough. Flash forward, 2002, US President George Bush characterizes Iran as part of an axis of evil. The speech causes outrage in Iran. Well, since then, the focus has been on Iran's nuclear ambitions. Successive rounds of sanctions that began in 2006 have isolated the country even more, as Professor Marandi was telling us there. Even more of a breakthrough, though, now. Presidents Barack Obama and Hassan Rouhani talking on the phone last year. The first time an American and Iranian presidents have talked in 30 years. Let's bring in Mr. Milani. No matter what you can say, I guess, about the state of the economy and political freedoms, no longer do foreign powers overthrow a government. Is that a plus in terms of Iran's relationship with the outside world, as tense as it might be?
One of the three major slogans or goals of the Islamic Revolution was to have political independence. And I think in the past 34 years, the Islamic Republic has proven that that goal of the revolution has been realized. Iranian policies today are no longer made in Washington or London or in Moscow. They are made in Tehran by the Iranians. That does not mean that their decisions are usually good ones, but it means that Iranians are masters of their own destiny. Now, when it comes to the US, Iran and the US have been at war with one another for the past 33 years. There is no question about the intensity of that war. However, I think in the past 6 months, because of the wise leadership, prudent leadership of Mr. Rouhani, we have put an end to the extremism of Ahmadinejad period. Iran has decided to normalize its relations with the rest of the world.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here now, Mr. Milani,
major points.
But because we've just got a couple of minutes left, I want to quickly bring in the perspectives of our other guests. Looking forward, Mr. Shahabi, do you share that optimism that going forward it looks like under President Rouhani, the best is yet to come in terms of foreign relations?
Well, I have to say that President Rouhani is saying all the right things. He's reaching out to the West, trying to put behind a legacy that was damaging to both countries. Now, whether he can actually achieve these goals is something continually different, in the sense that there are political factions within the country that are going to hold up a stop sign and a red signal at every turn that President Rouhani takes. But let me come back to this force that I want to talk about, which is the people. With a 75% of the population under the age of 35, underemployed, looking to the world, the free world, the digital world, the globalized world that we live in today, they want to be part of that. So there is a pressure from within to act responsibly, to work diligently, and I think President Rouhani has heard the signals. Now the question is, can this system deliver?
All right, let's take the question to Mr. Mohammad Marandi. How do you see the future going forward? I'm going to take a wild guess and say you probably disagree with some of the things that Mr. Shahabi has just said.
Well, I'd like to disagree with something that you said earlier on, actually, and that is that the United States didn't court Iran after the revolution. In fact, the reason why the embassy was taken was because the United States gave refuge to the Shah. And the Shah, in the eyes of the Iranians, was a mass murderer and should have been returned to the country to be put on trial. But regardless of that,
this is the 21st century.
I think that yes, and I think we have to stick to facts. I think the important point is that Iran, over the past 3.5 decades, is not the side that's been extremist. The United States helped Saddam Hussein, it helped the Shah, it helped Saddam use chemical weapons, it downed an Iranian airliner.
Okay, we've gone over that, Mr. Marandi. Let's look forward, because we've got about 30 seconds left.
But the Iranian people have their own model of government, and it is the only model that is working in this part of the world. The Americans have to recognize Iran as it is. If the Americans come to their senses and they behave rationally and reasonably, then rapprochement is possible.
Right, we're going to have to leave it there.
Confrontation will continue.
I'm afraid we are out of time, so let's thank our guests, Professor Mohammad Marandi, Shahriar Shahabi, and Mohsen Milani. Thank you all for joining us on Inside Story, and thank you too for joining us on this episode of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, you know where to go. Email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. It's goodbye for now.